Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of the Junkyard Dawgcast. I'm your host, Jordan Hill. Got the whole crew with us on this Tuesday afternoon. Guys, a lot to talk about around Georgia Bulldogs football as we continue through December, as we continue to close in on the early signing period. And guys, let's just get right into it. I really debated, hey, let's be funny. The big news. Oh, this backup offensive lineman's going in the portal. Yeah, that's what everyone's here about. No, let's just jump right into it. Dylan Raiola, nothing has happened as of Tuesday afternoon, but our expert Steve Wiltfong has moved his crystal ball from Raiola going to Georgia to going to Nebraska. Obviously, a lot of buzz about the five-star quarterback, one of the top players in the nation. And now we're sort of all on watch to see what happens with Dylan Raiola, what happens next. I believe it was On3 reported he's supposed to visit Lincoln, Nebraska this weekend. Obviously, there's family connections with Nebraska. His father having played there, his uncle being an offensive line coach for the Cornhuskers. I'm going to start with you, Kip. What did you make of this news on Monday night and the ramifications for Georgia if they do, in fact, lose Dylan Raiola?
I would be 100% lying if I thought that anyone in the industry or honestly anyone at Georgia saw this coming. I mean, I assume at this point that Georgia had that discussion with Dylan and maybe got word about a week ago. But just the fact that, how the news broke on Monday and just overall how quickly this came to pass. It's not something that anyone really had thought about, had written about, and even Nebraska writers caught off guard. So usually in these sorts of things, maybe the other team that's getting good news might lightly hint or try to keep it under wraps so that, they don't affect the process. But in this scenario, I think this is 100% just something that came to pass as quickly as we've seen it. And with it being a five-star quarterback, I don't know how many more times I'll be able to say this isn't really something I've covered or experienced in recruiting, but, going into year 18 now, but this is new. It's something new for Georgia, but it's also something, Georgia has seen five-star quarterbacks come and go. So I think right now my initial thoughts are it definitely stinks. He is a highly talented quarterback, but this is a recruiting story more than it's really a Georgia as a program story.
Yeah, I kind of hit on that, Kip, in the column I wrote on Tuesday that obviously, I think it's foolish if you're on the Georgia side of things to be like, this isn't that big a deal. He's not all that good. No, he's really talented. He he might he might have a really good career ahead of him. He's very talented. At the same time, I mean, Georgia's still got a whole lot of talent. Obviously, I mean, the big guy that everybody's talking about now is Ryan Puglisi, still being in the class, still sticking with that commitment with two quarterbacks at the time in the class. And now, obviously, he's the only quarterback in Georgia's 2024 class. But it definitely stings if you're Georgia to understand, that, the finish line is in sight when it comes to at least the December signing period, and that it looks like, the top player in your class is getting ready to flip and go to Nebraska. Ben, what were your thoughts on when this news came out, and any additional thoughts on just what this means for Georgia moving forward?
Well, you can obviously count me among the people that Kip's referring to that did not see this coming in a million years. I mean, I went to 6 Dylan Raiola football games this fall to go watch him play. I thought that he was a guy that had a great chance to be primed to be the quarterback of the future at Georgia. And so for this to happen this close to signing day is probably what's most jarring about it. I mean, I think, it's not something that was in our view. I think that to Kip's point, it was probably not into Georgia's view really until very, very recently. And there's not a whole lot of time to figure it out or deal with damage control or have a backup plan or whatever that might be. And so it's, the timing is probably what makes this the most surprising thing. I think that, I was trying to reach out to really whoever I could yesterday to figure out what the heck's even going on here. A lot of that consisted of people that are in Georgia's 2024 class, family members of people that are in the 2024 class. I think that there were a lot of folks that were really caught off guard by this happening. To Kip's point, I mean, there's been a major rallying cry. The message that I've gotten back around Ryan Puglisi, or Jordan, to what you pointed out around Ryan Puglisi, because Georgia's uniquely positioned to survive a situation like this because they have another Elite 11 quarterback. I think that there's a lot of people that feel really, really strongly about Ryan Puglisi as a quarterback. So, it's a bizarre situation. I never saw it coming. Obviously, to your point, Jordan, nothing has actually happened yet officially, but it feels like we all sort of know the general direction this is going, because he was supposed to be, getting to campus this weekend. A lot of early enrollees are coming in early this upcoming weekend. He was supposed to be among those. They're going to be moving in, doing bowl practices. I mean, again, for this to happen right now is really, really surprising. But for it to be Nebraska is not necessarily the surprising part. Like, if you had drawn up the scenario, hey, this is going to happen, who's it going to be? Nebraska would have been a logical choice because of his dad playing there, his uncle being on the staff as an offensive line coach. He did take a visit for a game earlier this season, and I think has been in Lincoln probably as much or more than he's been, any other school in the country. So not surprising necessarily that it's Nebraska, but surprising nonetheless that it's happening at all.
Saw one of the comments asking about his uncle getting an extension, if that played into it. I don't think the money part of it does, but I do think that on one side of it, you do feel pretty good that your uncle is going to be around. That he is going to be on staff while he is there. We talked about this a little bit before we started recording, but I wanted to bring it back up because I think people are wondering. And I'll ask you, Kip, do you see this having a domino effect with Georgia's class? What do you make of what happens now? Again, has been hinted at, and what makes it kind of weird to talk about. Nothing's happened yet, but all indications are that Dylan Raiola will not be part of the signing class.
With 1 week to go until the early signing period, I mean, this is officially the silly season, and we're talking about something that a lot of recruiting fans would see as being pretty silly. Just a guy potentially flipping his commitment as a quarterback, right at signing day. I think this is why the coaches go out and do in-home visits. This is why the last week is important. You have to secure everyone. A lot of fans on the Junkyard at Dogs 247 and all across, 24/7 Sports want to get those in-home visit updates. But they want those updates on the uncommitted guys. They want to know, when is Kirby Smart going to see KJ Bolden? Like, what other guys? Who is Georgia going to flip? When you hear, Kirby Smart is visiting, your running back commitment, your linebacker commitment, Justin Williams, it doesn't really, there isn't as much fanfare. But now this is probably pretty important, because the reason why these guys are committed to Georgia is because they're among the best players in the country, and they're wanted by a lot of programs. And those programs are still trying to get every one of Georgia's commitments. And so it's vital for Georgia to hold on to all these other guys. As far as, Dylan Raiola, it's an individual recruitment. Everyone always talks about how quarterbacks are, the Pied Pipers, how they lead all these other guys into the fold. When we watch this entire cycle, honestly, I can't really tell you which guy Georgia wasn't already trending with that they landed on the commitment list after getting Dylan Raiola's commitment. Obviously, it gave them a lot of positive pub, but every single guy that they have on the commitment list was already looking at Georgia seriously, already had Georgia basically as their leader. And I don't really think you connect his potential decommitment to any other recruit. It is just a reminder to Georgia that they got to make sure they lock all of these guys down, because one recruitment not going to topple Georgia. I think this is a situation where this news is more good news for Nebraska than it is bad news for Georgia, as far as where these programs are and where they're trying to get to right now. So again, individually, it's a loss. But there are still positives. Obviously, Georgia already has a quarterback on board, like Ben mentioned, who's very talented. And I think it's also just good news for Gunnar Stockton. He could be that, next Carson Beck. If we're talking about, down the road, a guy who now could be potentially the backup next season. He could follow in the footsteps of both Stetson Bennett and Carson Beck the last couple of years of, getting more experience and being more ready. So if you want to look at that positive sign for Georgia, I think it helps them keep Gunnar Stockton in the fold, and it helps him have a stronger position to get more experience moving forward at Georgia.
I think you make a very good point, Kip. When he committed, We were looking around. Hey, could Ryan Wingo? Could maybe they flip Jeremiah Smith? What would it look like from the receiver standpoint? And it never really came to pass when it came to some of those top wide receivers. And obviously, Georgia would love to keep Dylan Raiola in this class, but it looks like there's not going to be a ton of ramifications as far as guys who said, oh, I want to go play with Dylan Raiola, and deciding that now that he's not coming to Georgia, that they're not coming to Georgia either. Ben, any additional thoughts you have on that 2024 class, the ramifications if and when Dylan Raiola winds up committing elsewhere?
I probably echo what Kip said there in that I don't think he's directly tied to or linked to a specific recruit that would cause them to flip away from Georgia because he's no longer in the class. That said, I think that it probably does open our eyes a little bit to say, all right, down the stretch here, who are the guys whose recruitments are still a little bit interesting? Nitro Tuggle, Nate Frazier, Justin Williams, guys that are really, really good football players that have very competitive recruitments. Does this mean anything in terms of the ability to steal players away from Georgia at the last second when you're maybe not expecting it? I think that we've come to be so familiar with Georgia being bulletproof in a lot of those regards because you want to sign with Georgia here down the stretch. Well, obviously, if a 5-star quarterback is flipping, and again, I noticed a comment as well asking like, has he flipped it? As of us recording this, he has not. This is just the way that it's trending, and based on the things that we've been piecing together and conversations that we've had over the last, 12 hours or so, 15, 30, 20 hours or so, it seems that it's going that direction.
Definitely, and we will keep you guys all informed when it comes to his recruitment, if he does make an announcement, if he does make a decision, and we will let you guys know over at Dogs 24/7. A lot of recruiting news on the front for Georgia when it comes to this signing class getting wrapped up, and also when it comes to the transfer portal. A big weekend this past weekend for Georgia, having guys on campus trying to convince them to eventually sign with the Bulldogs. Ben, just tell us about what Georgia was able to do this past weekend as far as bringing guys on campus, some of the names to know, and some of the recruitments to watch over these next few weeks.
The 3 transfer possibilities that were on campus at some point over the weekend were Vanderbilt wide receiver London Humphreys, South Carolina defensive lineman Xavier McLeod, and USC wide receiver Michael Jackson. So those 3 were the ones that I would pay most attention to at this point in time. London Humphreys in particular is the one that I think has been most closely linked to Georgia throughout this process, really ever since he entered his name into the portal. Jordan, you spoke with him obviously after his visit, and I know that you'll share some things from that as well. But I mean, I think that we all agree we expect London Humphreys to probably end up on Georgia's roster here sometime in the near future. Who knows, depending on when you're able to produce this podcast, who knows exactly when what the news is at that point in time either. But that's a receiver that fits a lot of the things that Georgia looks for. Multiple years of eligibility left, had some success against Georgia, runs like a 4.4, has, state record times in the state of Tennessee in the 200 meter. I mean, track level speed that Georgia's looking for from the receiver position. So that's the guy of the group that has been on campus already that I would point to and say, I'd be surprised if he doesn't end up in Georgia's class. The other guys, Xavier McLeod, I know Kip, you spoke with Xavier, so I'm sure that you'll have a little bit more insight into what he said specifically about that visit. But someone that Georgia recruited out of high school fits, I saw someone earlier comment as well. Georgia needs more defensive linemen. Well, that's what they're going to be seeking out in the portal where they can find it. He definitely fits that as well. And then Michael Jackson, aside from obviously being named Michael Jackson, really good wide receiver from USC. He was on campus at the end of the weekend and into yesterday, Monday as well. So I don't have as much info yet on what to take away from that. But again, anytime that these guys are using their first visit that they really can have during this transfer window to get to Athens, it's probably a pretty good indicator of where they consider Georgia in their transfer recruitment.
Follow the visits is always the lesson when it comes really to just recruiting in general. I'll talk a little bit about London Humphreys. As you mentioned, Ben, I talked to him Sunday night after he'd finished his visit in Athens. A lot of positives to take away from his experience at Georgia. He really raved about the support staff, how much they care about the players. He said they really sold him on the development that he could have if he came to Georgia. If you're listening to this and you're like, who is London Humphreys? I didn't really follow Vanderbilt that much. If you watch that Georgia Vanderbilt game, you remember him. He took a slant for 49 yards for a touchdown on Vanderbilt's opening drive. A very talented kid. Ben, as you had mentioned on the board several times, talking to one of his high school coaches, just how fast he is and the talent he has. He's definitely a guy that checks a lot of boxes for Georgia. From what I can tell, and I shared this in the story that I wrote on Monday, I feel really, really good about his chances at landing at Georgia. Not planning on taking any other visits as of when I talked to him on Sunday night. Seems like it's a decision that's coming sooner rather than later. Didn't share exactly when that's going to be, but I think that it is trending very, very positively for Georgia, and I do think London Humphreys winds up becoming a Georgia Bulldog. Kip, what did you take away from talking to Xavier McLeod? What stood out to you and where he is at this point?
Yeah, it's an interesting situation. I mean, Xavier was one of the Georgia's top targets along the defensive line, a guy that could play 5 technique, but could also slide inside on passing downs. Pick South Carolina. I think if you look at that situation, it was one where Georgia felt really good about his recruitment, but South Carolina had a connection with Jimmy Lindsey, who was the defensive line coach there, and that won in the end. But then right after that, Lindsey left to be the defensive line coach at LSU. So, South Carolina had a defensive line coach right after Xavier McLeod came on board. They hired Travian Robertson as their defensive line coach, I believe, from Tulane. And, 4 games into his freshman season, I think Xavier felt like this wasn't the right situation, didn't have that connection. He wasn't, obviously playing time's always a factor. He was, getting some playing time, but not what he envisioned, which, again, that pretty common now with the transfer portal. That's kind of a pretty big factor. So after 4 games, he wanted to, preserve that. He wanted to use the red shirt, and they, South Carolina, really wasn't on the same page. And they kind of parted ways there. And I think this is just a situation where he wanted to hit the reset button. He's basically a high school recruit all over again. So what was the other school he was heavily considering? And that's Georgia. And, he had a relationship with the entire Georgia coaching staff, and he now feels comfortable about, that situation. He made sure to visit them that first weekend, this past weekend. And I think right now is, he hasn't really said any other visits. I know LSU, Florida State, they're both interested as well. And so right now he's finishing up classes this week and kind of looking to see what that next step is. But I know that Trey Scott told him, hey, man, I hope you shut it down and come here. And so he knows he's wanted it, Georgia. I think right now he knows Georgia is a pretty strong fit. And I like where Georgia's chances are. And this is a guy that was, again, pretty highly regarded by Georgia coming out of high school, Campton, South Carolina, a 4-star recruit. And like we said, they need multiple defensive linemen. I think getting Xavier McLeod would be a strong start. And I think that's something that could probably happen, in the next couple of weeks, by the end of the month.
I want to make sure before we take a break, Patrick Burns on Facebook asked, are we going to land Trevor Etienne? Ben, you had a good note, just a general note on Monday about his recruitment. Just what can you tell us about the former Florida running back and where things stand as he's going through his recruitment?
Yeah, well, it was almost like a re-temperature check on things from last week when I had done my hot, lukewarm, cold. He had been in the hot category. I would still consider him more in the hot category than any other category, but I did want to just call out that recruitment at this point appears to be a little bit more competitive than the London Humphreys and the Xavier McLeod ones were. Like, I feel like Georgia's probably just a little bit more well-positioned. That's evidenced by the fact that they were already on campus. So again, I do think that Georgia and Etienne are in communication, that Georgia is a school that he is strongly considering. I know that there was a lot of buzz with Etienne and Georgia prior to him entering the portal, when he entered the portal, and since he's entered the portal, and that hasn't changed. But I do think that there are other running back situations at premier programs. He's said that he wants to win and he wants to be as much of a feature guy as he can possibly be. And I think that, Georgia potentially provide some of that. I think Ohio State probably provides some of that as well. LSU probably provides a little bit of that as well. So I think that there's still some, news to unfold with the Trevor Etienne recruitment, but I definitely think that Georgia is going to be involved and has as good of a shot as anyone at this point in time.
We're going to take a quick break, come back, talk about some of the portal departures for Georgia and Georgia's 2024 schedule. Looking at the portal, I wanted to take this question from Facebook and Timothy Wilson. Is it me, or does it feel like mass exiting in Georgia? Does missing the college football playoff have a large part to do with it? That's exactly what it is, Timothy. And if you'll remember, you saw this after the playoff last year, after Georgia won the national title. I don't remember off the top of my head how many guys wound up leaving, but once you're sort of out of that playoff picture, you're going to see guys leave. You're going to see guys decide to go elsewhere to look at other options. And that's exactly what's happened with Georgia. I don't think there's really any reason to panic if you're a Georgia fan thinking that things are, the ship's sinking, all this stuff. It's just sort of a timing situation. If Georgia would have beaten Alabama in the SEC title game, this would have been prolonged, would have gone into probably mid-January before you saw this. And sort of piggybacking off of that, since the last time we recorded, 7 Georgia players have gone into the portal. I believe that's up to 13 that we have at this point. Running through them really quick, kicker Jared Zirkle, cornerback Nyland Green, receiver Mekhi Muse, inside linebackers E.J. Lightsey and Xavier Sori, receiver Zeed Haynes, and offensive guard Alu Ba. So you've got a lot of guys in that portal. Again, I can understand why fans are a little bit concerned seeing the numbers and understanding, that there may be a few more guys who go in, but I'll start with you, Kip, and I'll sort of give my opinion that there's not been a ton of surprises with these guys. I think the biggest one is probably Zeed Haynes, just because he was young. He's just a freshman and pretty highly hyped when he first got to Georgia. Didn't play a ton this year. But other than that, a lot of these guys have been backups, guys that were sort of buried on the depth chart. Do you sort of see that the same way, Kip, with these guys that have left at this point?
Yeah, and I'll just point out that the last 3 years, Georgia lost 10 guys, 12 guys, and last year, after winning back-to-back national championships, they lost 15 guys to the transfer portal. And this is just how rosters reset every offseason. If you're like I said before with Xavier McLeod, if you're not getting the playing time you thought, or that clock is starting to tick towards you trying to put out some film for a potential NFL future, you're going to head to the portal. Guys doing it after one season, like we said with Zeed Haynes, yeah, that one's a little tough because you want these guys to maybe have a little bit more patience and know that you're playing a position that requires you to pick up a lot more of the playbook, especially at Georgia. You're trying to get the NFL while they're running that system that you need to learn to be able to get to the NFL. They're asking you to do things NFL teams ask their guys to do. So that's one where, it's probably you'd like to have him back. But, yeah, at the same time, these guys were, mostly not on the too deep. Nyland Green, Xavier Sori were guys that were rotating in, but they'd already put in multiple years and, hadn't gotten to where they really wanted to be or felt they should be. So it's also still, like I said, an opportunity for Georgia. They continue to bring in elite talent every year, mostly through the high school ranks. But again, they're going to see if there's any guys out there themselves that they can upgrade at multiple positions. Like we said, wide receiver, defensive line, potentially an offensive tackle or safety if they can get it. And obviously one of the best running backs in the SEC is looking heavily at Georgia right now. So the transfer portal is giving guys more freedom to find new places. But for Georgia, I think there's still been a net positive impact on the roster, especially with Kirby Smart wanting to build this roster mostly through high school recruiting.
saw a comment that said, "Why do the three of us look depressed?" I think we always look like that. I don't think that has anything to do with anything going on. That's just the nature and the truth after a long football season. That's just sort of what we look like. Ben, what do you think about the guys that have gone in the portal to this point, and potentially leaving Georgia? Just what you make of this group?
To this point, I would not say that there's anybody that necessarily surprised us. I mean, I think that Zeke Haynes probably fit most into the young wide receivers. You don't really know exactly. You assume you're probably going to see some churn there when there's not a lot of playing time across the board. And obviously Anthony Evans seemed to have sort of earned the most playing time among that group. So I think that Zeke Haynes and Tyler Williams were probably both names that were like in consideration as possible, transfer risks. Everyone else, I mean, Xavier Story, Mekhi Muse probably had the most on-field impact. But again, I don't think that it's not program changing. And I mean, that's the thing, to Kip's point of everything we talked about, Dylan Raiola, individual players, it's really hard for you to be program changing at this point in Georgia's maturation as a program. I mean, you have to really, really, really be a difference maker and be a really surprise when you're leaving for it to have that probably level of impact. So I would say that it's more just Georgia's trying to get its roster numbers where it needs to get them to. I think that probably, and this is not naming any names or anything like that, the transfers that are going to hurt if you feel them are going to be the ones that haven't announced yet, because they're the ones that have been having retention conversations with Georgia, where Georgia has been making serious efforts to try and hold on to them. And that's a whole part of the game these days with the transfer portal and NIL and schools having to work on retention and all of that. It's a different game that Kirby Smart and his group has to play in terms of determining who do we prioritize to hold on to the roster. All of that's happening right now. And the guys that you don't want to transfer are the ones that Georgia is probably more willing to be having those difficult conversations with longer into this portal window. So I'd probably, if you're worried about any guys that would be leaving, I'd probably be looking forward more than looking behind, because I think most of the guys that are already in the portal were to be expected, or you could at least, make a case for why it made sense.
I want to make sure before we get off the portal talk to just talk briefly about a couple of the guys that were at Georgia who have already found homes at the collegiate level elsewhere. Jonathan Jefferson going to SMU, Brock Vandagriff to Kentucky, which we have not done a podcast since then. I'll start with you, Kip. Just what do you make about Brock Vandagriff staying in the SEC, going to Lexington, what that can mean for Brock and what that can mean for Kentucky?
Yeah, I think it's a great fit. Obviously, he had his mindset that he wanted to get his degree from Georgia and find a new home. And I look at the Kentucky the last couple of years, and the quarterback position. I think they are now that kind of team where they're going to look every year and try to find a potential NFL level quarterback to kind of plug in there. And so I think that's kind of where Kentucky is. And I think it's really going to give him an opportunity to put out NFL film. I think it's interesting. Obviously, we're still waiting to see what happens with Carson Beck. He has not announced anything as we record this podcast. We all still kind of feel that he is leaning towards coming back for next season, which obviously would be bigger news than any quarterback Georgia's involved with right now. So don't no one should forget that when they're thinking the sky is falling. But I do think that you look at Brock Vandagriff and knowing that he didn't get that opportunity to start his first couple of years. Not everyone is going to be a Carson Beck and wait till you potentially only have 2 years of eligibility to be a starter. And that's where Brock Vandagriff is right now. I mean, he's got 2 years to get out there and show himself to the world what he can do. And so I think it's a natural fit after watching Will Levis there, after watching Devin Leary there. He slides right in as that next guy. And he's obviously physically talented, and we haven't really been able to see what he can do as a starter, but it's a great fit for him. And I think it's going to make for an interesting SEC slate.
Definitely. Ben, what were your thoughts about Vandagriff and deciding to stay within the SEC?
Well, to Kip's point around we've seen it with Devin Leary, we've seen it with Will Levis. Like, I'm fascinated to see what the hype train around Brock Vandagriff becomes, because he was a 5-star recruit. He played for a team. He's played for teams that won national championships. Everyone is impressed by his physical tools. And like, if we know anything about how Will Levis and Devin Leary were portrayed coming into their seasons, like, I expect Brock Vandagriff to be viewed as probably one of the 5 best quarterbacks in the country, 10 best quarterbacks in the country, which is like, wild probably from our vantage point, because we know that we've been seeing him sit behind folks. But I'm just fascinated to see how all of that plays out. And I think that he has an opportunity to be really successful as well. So I don't just say it all in jest around what the hype train could be. Like, I think that it's a good fit for him in terms of what they've proven they can do. I mean, again, Will Levis was almost exactly the same, a guy that played for a really good football program, that was behind a quarterback that had played and been in the system for a long time, and he knew he wasn't going to get his shot there. So he transferred to Kentucky, and, for a long portion of his season, people thought he was going to be the number 1 overall pick, or that he was in the conversation to be the number 1 overall pick. I'm not ruling it out that Brock Vandagriff could have a similar hype train around him. He's obviously got to, put the product out on the field as well, but I think he's fully capable of doing it. So I will say, though, as it relates to Georgia, I'm not making a Carson Beck decision or announcement or anything like that. But given what we've already said in this podcast about Dylan Raiola trending away from Georgia, obviously Brock Vandagriff going to Kentucky, if Carson Beck is not coming back to Georgia and the quarterback roster next year is Gunnar Stockton and Ryan Puglisi, we've got way more quarterback news to be coming in the future as well. But all that to say, not that any of those things were directly in line with whatever Carson was going to be doing, but I think that Georgia would probably have navigated the quarterback situation a little bit differently here down the stretch if they didn't think that Carson was coming back.
100%. And if he leaves, I'm putting all my money on Jackson Muschamp, QB1, when we go into 2024. Speaking of 2024, Wednesday night, the SEC is going to announce the schedules for all 16 teams as we get ready for Texas and Oklahoma to join the conference. We were able to get our hands on Georgia's schedule a little bit ahead of time. I wanted to run through that for everybody in case you missed that story last week, and just to get Ben and Kip's thoughts on that. Run through this real quick, starting with week 1 and going down the slate. Georgia will open versus Clemson in Atlanta. Then you've got versus Tennessee Tech at Kentucky, which will probably be against Brock Vandagriff there in week 3. A bye week. Then you have at Alabama versus Auburn versus Mississippi State at Texas, another bye week. Florida and Jacksonville at Ole Miss versus Tennessee versus UMass, and then ending the regular season at home against Georgia Tech. I'll start with you, Ben. Any initial thoughts on what this schedule looks like for Georgia in 2024? Any matchups that really catch your eye, or things that might concern you for the Bulldogs going into next year?
Well, at Texas, at Alabama, I think is probably the thing that catches everybody's eye. If you're a Georgia fan that likes to go on the road, get your Airbnbs and hotels and flights and all that booked, especially for Austin, because you're battling with Formula One fans as well. They're going to be there that same weekend. So those are the two, big time road games. I think, if I'm not mistaken, you're looking at it, Jordan, so you can correct me. I think it's 3 home games through the first 11 weeks. Is that right?
I think it might be 4, because you got Mississippi State, Auburn. Clemson's in Atlanta, so yeah, I think it's 3. I was counting Clemson as a home game. So, I mean, that's, a lot of things not happening in Sanford Stadium to start the year. So, you're probably end of season, if Georgia's gotten through the gauntlet, well through those first 11 weeks, you're probably going to have some good fun times in Sanford Stadium to close out the season, but you're going to have to be either watching on TV or hitting the road to go see them. So that's probably what's most intriguing. Aside from, we just mentioned Brock Vandagriff, I do find going on the road to play Brock Vandagriff week 3 is fascinating. I don't know Kentucky's schedule, but I would assume that's probably his first SEC game assuming he's the Kentucky quarterback. So fitting little full circle moment for him too. Kip, what are your thoughts on how this schedule is shaping up?
Well, yeah, I was going to say the SEC opener already has its own storyline. I think that's going to be fun to watch. Playing Alabama and Auburn back to back, find that interesting. Playing Auburn, I guess now this is the new normal. I guess the 5th game of the season. So that's I guess just where things are going to be in the Georgia-Auburn game. But, at least the game is still happening. I can't imagine, them going into next season and just not having Auburn on the schedule. So it could be worse. But you look at this and you go, well, I think if you're Kirby Smart, you are glad this is when the 12-team playoff is here. It couldn't come at a better time. And so if Georgia goes undefeated this season, you go ahead and give them Coach of the Year. You're not really worried about what happens in Atlanta. And, you just sit out your guys if you want to and play the backups. That would be a fun discussion to have on what Georgia should actually do in that game if they already know they're in. Kirby Smart's built this team for a 12 team playoff. And if you look at the last 7 years of regular season, they went 7-2 during the pandemic year, but you got 11-1, 11-1, 11-1, 12-0, 12-0, 12-0. So if any team's built for a regular season slate, and no matter how easy or tough it is, I think Georgia's consistency translates into what's going to happen with this 12-team playoff. And so, it's going to be a tough slate. I think you look at the in between their 2 bye weeks. I think that's the stretch you really look at as the toughest, trips of the season. And so that's kind of the fascinating thing. When they have the first bye, they come off that, play Alabama, Auburn, Mississippi State, at Texas, and then you have your second bye, obviously, to get prepared for Florida. So that stretch right there is going to be kind of the tail of the season. But then you look at after the second bye, it's the same as last year. You got Florida, Ole Miss, and Tennessee, and playing Jackson Dart at home, coming off a 10-win season, figures to be a pretty interesting game as well. So I think this is obviously coming off a year where Georgia's schedule was questioned by everyone. I don't, the narrative this time next year, it will not be about, Georgia not having earned whatever game they're playing in December and January.
Kip, you hit on the stretch that to me is the most intriguing with Alabama, at home against Auburn, at home against Mississippi State, at Texas. To me, all 4 of those games are super interesting. We don't have to break down Alabama and Texas because they're both in the college football playoff this year. They figure to be good. Auburn, guys, I think is going to be significantly better, especially on offense next year. Definitely helps to have them in Sanford Stadium, a place they have not won since 2005. And then Mississippi State's kind of the wild card with Jeff Levy coming in. We don't really know what that's going to look like, and they've been super busy so far this offseason. That stretch to me is going to determine what Georgia's season looks like. And again, we've talked a lot about Carson Beck, but if you can get him back, that is going to be so huge for navigating some of these really, really challenging games that you're going to be playing next year. Before we get out of here, let's do a little Georgia men's basketball minute. Since the last time we recorded, Georgia got a big win in clean, old-fashioned hate, 76-62 over Georgia Tech. Really dominated this one. Really set the stage for a big game. Took control early. I think they led for about 39 minutes of the 40 minutes of action. Blue Kane, a former Georgia Tech signee, has a big game. They take care of business. They are now 3-1 against ACC competition, 6-3 overall. 4 home games left in the calendar year. All 4 very winnable there in Stegman Coliseum. So things are going well for Georgia basketball. 6-3, got a real chance to end non-conference play at 10-3, and they better make the most of it because their start to conference play is super, super challenging at Missouri, home against Arkansas, home against Tennessee. So they got to get all their wins right now because it may be a really rough start to the month of January. We are going to wrap up the podcast right there. I appreciate everyone who watched this live, everyone who's listening to this after the fact, everybody that's arguing in the comments. Man, it has been so long since we've had that, guys. You know how pumped I am to see that? That means that everybody's tuning in. Everybody's got something to say for sure. Appreciate everyone for tuning in. Make sure and go to dogs247.com if you haven't already. We will have the latest on Dylan Raiola, all the recruiting news, all the portal news as we continue to watch to see what happens on that front. Also, be sure to go to Dogs247 on YouTube. Go subscribe. You got the Kirby Smart press conferences, the player press conferences, Mike White interviews, Georgia men's basketball interviews, and all these podcast episodes. So for Kip Adams and Benjamin Wolk, I am Jordan Hill. Until next time, take care, everybody.